Danny, you're a freak who gets violent every time something doesn't go your way. She was almost yelling at me by now, and I waited, listening to her complaints. You'd think after 16 years this damn record would be broken. Besides, you've been gone her whole life. That hurt. Sandra stood there like a victorious warrior enjoying the capture of a trophy scalp or ear, depending on what kind of war she was fighting. In this case, she'd fought to keep me out of the prom, and she'd lost. I had loved her once. Hell, she loved me, at least that's what she said. I don't think I ever knew that for sure, but somewhere along the way, love turned into a fierce rivalry. You're the one who's been trying to keep me away from her for the last 16 years, I replied. Bullshit! The judge and everyone else has seen what you were, and still are as far as I'm concerned. I didn't stand a chance. I remember the night I walked into the room after drinking half a fifth of something and found my wife with some idiot. I looked him in the eye and made it clear that he should leave, which he did. It did a lot of good. I ended up in the county jail, but was bailed out by my top and taken to Camp Pendleton. 2 days later, Sandra served me with a restraining order, and the locals dropped the charges against me on the condition that I go within 30 days. In retrospect, I realized that was the plan. We'd broken up almost 6 months ago when she'd left me for the bastard she'd had fun with that night, but in this crazy world called California, she was perfectly capable of having fun with an entire battalion of recruits if it mattered. In the end, she got everything. Not that it was much, but she got my daughter Jace sole custody, and I got orders to stay 1,000 yards away from the two of them and that bastard Corey Taylor. Worst of all, she married the creep 2 months after our divorce was final, and while I was away, she tried to get Jace adopted by Taylor. Luckily, the court required at least my permission, and I wasn't there to give it even if I wanted to, which I didn't. Anyway, I was totally screwed, and all I had left was a career as a Marine and a lot of distance between me and my daughter. All I want to do is attend my daughter's graduation, Sandra. Then I'll get out of your way again, and your fabulous life will continue. I thought I caught some expression on her face, and it lingered for another moment before we were interrupted. I want him to leave, Mom. We both turned toward the door, and my heart dropped when I saw my daughter Jace for the first time in almost 5 years. She walked over to us and reached out to give me a hug. Hi, Daddy. Hello, Jace. I couldn't speak anymore because of the tears and choking. Sandra tried to say something but was stopped. No more, Mommy. Next chapter. Rhonda Bro had one hell of a daughter named Sandra. I met her at a diner in San Diego, swept her off her feet, and dragged her into a cheap motel room down the street. That was Friday night, and on Sunday we came up for air, and after a whirlwind courtship over bottles of beer and motel rooms, we were married 4 months later. I was 23, and she was just over 19. A couple years later, Jace showed up, and things went downhill from there. I did short assignments on the CVN 71 Theodore Roosevelt out of San Diego, and was away from home for up to 6 months. She knew what she was getting into when we got married. Her mom, Rhonda, had been married for 25 years to a Marine Corps aviator who had died 10 years earlier on an exercise off the island of Guam. Rhonda put me through the whole ordeal with one side and the other before giving her blessing on our marriage. I ended up having a longtime friend that I didn't even realize I had until it was really important. I suppose sometimes you can see it coming, but in my case, I should have seen it coming months earlier. I came in from rotation after a 3-month tour, and it hit me right in the face. I'm getting a divorce, Danny. You're what? Divorce? I'm getting a divorce. I'm sorry, I didn't plan it, but I found someone else. She started talking shit about how I wasn't there for her, and that she never wanted this to happen, but it all just pissed me off. Jace is at his mom's for a few days. I want you to move out this weekend. I left papers on the kitchen table for you to sign. With those words, she was out the door, and my beer bottle hit the screen just after she pulled into the driveway. Things went on from there. Somehow, through the fog, I managed to gather all my stuff and deposit it before I signed out at the barracks. Since I was a sergeant, I was assigned one of the column 4 corner rooms on the floor. I wasn't alone. There were 3 other sergeants on the floor, and each of them had gone through at least one divorce. They found a solution to my problems at the distillery, and I stayed there for the next 6 months when I wasn't working. The problem was that the booze wasn't helping either, and the rage kept building until one night I got drunk. I found myself outside my old house, and there was someone else's car parked in the driveway. I pulled an old key out of the mailbox and let myself in. Tonight I realized that it's all my fault. That woman left me alone, and I should have moved on, and things could have turned out differently. Unfortunately, I had half a fifth and an excess of stupidity in me to go up against a woman who didn't give a shit about me anyway. I stood in the bedroom doorway watching this fat freak entertain my wife, or at least she was supposed to be my wife. I grabbed the bastard. At that point, I drew my M1911 pistol, and it scared him so bad he immediately started pissing on the carpet at his feet, looking at me in horror. I think he still believes to this day that I was going to destroy him right there. If I still had half a fifth in me, I would have. He knew enough to run like hell, and he did, right out of the house. Sandra, on the other hand, sat calmly in her seat, as she had the day she was born, and dialed 911. She didn't say a word, and I just went down to the kitchen and found a beer in the fridge, one of those expensive imported ales. The bastard must have money. 15 minutes later, I was arrested and sitting in the back of the car, heading to jail. 22 days after that, I was out to sea on a 6-month tour. Shortly after that, I realized that I had really screwed up and tried to make something out of this unpleasant situation. I wrote letters. Hell, I wrote a whole bunch of letters, but to no avail, until I wrote one to Rhonda Bro. I got a reply when we were in the port of Yokosuka, Japan. Sandra hated me for what I did that night and wouldn't let me have any contact with them. Rhonda was much more lenient. She wrote me a long letter that included the following. Dear Danny boy, you're a serious bugger if they're keeping you in Sushi Town. You know that, don't you? I know you're hurting from everything that's happened, but I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to help. Little Jace spends a lot of time with me, and she'll know about her daddy no matter what her mother is up to. When the judge stopped her attempted adoption, she should have realized what she was doing. When you're here on base, I'll make sure you get to see your daughter. In the meantime, here are some pictures of her. I gotta go. Hey, stay away from all that weird stuff, or you'll eat shit you can't even pronounce. Love, Rhonda's mom. The pictures were precious, and Rhonda became as close to me as my own departed mom. For the next few years, that's how we lived. I'd stop by when I was in port and spend time with Jace. Rhonda wrote letters and sent me pictures. Then war came to my doorstep, and everything changed. We had been in Afghanistan since late 2001, and I still hadn't shipped out. Instead, I continued my sea duty with an aircraft carrier group. The beginning of 2003 changed everything. In February 2003, I departed from Pendleton and landed in Kuwait. Rhonda kept in touch with me throughout my deployment, and when I returned to the States in mid-2004, I spent as much time with Jace as possible. This continued for the next few years. I went to Afghanistan and ended up getting shot at twice. The second time I got a star for carrying a Marine through a fire zone. I don't know what I was thinking. I was scared to death. Back in the States, I dated Jace for a while until I was talked into going to Paris Island to train recruits. Rhonda and I connected to a laptop so that Jace and I could talk and see each other, and things were good for a while. All the while, Rhonda kept Sandra in the dark. I don't know what she would have done if she hadn't disowned her mother. Rhonda never talked about it, and Sandra never asked. Before coming back to the States for good in 2006, I was in Iraq one more time and came back from there with the rank of machine gunner. I was lucky, considering I was demoted to corporal under Article 15 after an incident with an asshole that landed me in prison. The next 4 years passed without much happening. I just wanted to get my 20 so I could get my ETS and get back out into the world. By that time I had been in 2, actually 3 conflicts, was wounded twice and awarded a Silver Star. I didn't think that was bad for a 38-year-old lowlife from Beaumont, Texas. About the time I retired, I stopped hearing from Rhonda and Jace. I didn't pay much attention to it for a while, but after a month I tried to call Rhonda and found that her phone was no longer working. "Sandra, it's me, Danny. I'm trying to reach Rhonda." She hung up, I called her back, and on the third try she picked up. "Seriously, that's all I need." "Mom died last month." There was a long silence before I decided to ask the next question. "Can I talk to Jace?" "No, I want you to leave. My mom let you in the house for her own reasons, but my husband and I won't let you anywhere near us for a minute." She ended the conversation and I sat there, numb to the news. I loved Rhonda like my own mom, and she was my lifeline in Jace's life. She was almost 13 now, but I had no way to contact her except to just show up. I tried to do that, but all I got from my trouble was that the ADA told me I had to move on and hire a lawyer if I didn't like it. I don't know if Jace was there or not, but I know the bastard and Sandra were there. At that point, I turned the matter over to the lawyer. Being a free man, I did what freedom implies. I hit the road. I spent the next 12 months traveling around the United States, sending postcards to Jace every chance I got. I drank too much, spent 3 days in jail in Reno, Nevada. All that stopped when I found myself married to a casino worker on an Indian reservation in southern Oklahoma. Winona was the most uninhibited woman I had ever dated. She was the exact opposite of Sandra. It was the perfect marriage, and it stayed that way for a year until her real husband showed up. Yes, she was already married and had committed bigamy when she married me. He was on an overseas tour with an oil company and was none too pleased when he walked into the house that used to be his home and found me eating eggs and cookies at his kitchen table. His wife and my wife were standing at the sink washing coffee cups. "Who the hell are you, you bastard?" I don't know if he really wanted an answer to the question or not, but I got up from the chair before Winona could turn around. He clarified his question. "Did you entertain my goddamn wife?" The scale of the set needs to be clarified here. Brent Gustafson probably weighed around 280, maybe more, at 6 inches versus my 6 inches and 180, and he was clearly not a fat guy. "She's my wife and has been for a year now." "And who the hell are you?" I replied hesitantly. He looked at Winona standing next to the sink and back at me before turning and walking back into the living room. The weirdest scene I'd ever been in. "Winona, I'm going to go get a beer. Take out the trash and explain the hell out of it when I get back or I'll rip his head off." With those words, the big guy walked out. With a concerned look on her face, she sat down at the table. When she was done, all I had to do was shake my head and get dressed. About an hour later, I gathered my things and loaded them into the car. I would miss her, but I knew I would get over her quickly. Next chapter. I grew up in Beaumont, Texas, worked my way through high school, and joined the Marines right out of high school, just in time for the end of Desert Storm. It wasn't long, and I soon found myself stateside, where all of the events I described above took place. Now I was back on home soil. One of the factories along the Neches River took me on as a laborer during the shutdown, and that suited me just fine. They took me on contract work, and I worked 80-plus hours a week when they were in repair, and took vacation for the next 3 weeks. That brought in more than my Marine paycheck a month, and I had something to do on a regular basis. My experience with Winona had pretty much closed the door on future attempts at marriage, at least for the time being. Instead, I settled for a semi-exclusive relationship that met the needs of everyone involved. Lainey Johnson had 2 kids, an ex-husband who still lived with her for money, and she believed any shit the sprawling asshole threw her way. Gullibility was her middle name. I don't know what she saw in me, but I appreciated her approval. "Do you know how to fish, Danny?" she asked me one night. "A little." "Can you teach my 2 little ones how to catch catfish? They've been asking, and their dad thinks fish grow in the grocery store." So I became a fishing buddy for her 8-year-old boy and 6-year-old girl, Jimmy and Lucy. When I was a kid, we fished for catfish in the far tributaries of the Neches River. You had to go through the tides to stay in fresh water, But we always caught 2 3-pound channel cats. That's where I took the kids. They took to it very well, and we developed a good relationship. Kids are not like adults in terms of holding back what's on their minds. "Daddy is very angry with you, Mr. Danny," said Jimmy one morning as we were wetting the fishing line on the grassy bank. "Why?" "Because Mommy and you are friends." "Well, people need friends, you know. I'm sorry your daddy's mad at me. I'll talk to your mom about it if that's okay with you." For most kids, life is pretty simple. Jimmy's mom had a friend. His dad was mad about it, and I was supposed to take care of it. It was pretty simple. The problem was, it wasn't that simple. The ex-husband wasn't just living in the old marital home for economic reasons. He wanted his old lady back, and I was in his way. I don't know what caused their divorce, but I find some things funny. One of them is participating in the destruction of other people's family situations. "Did Jimmy tell you that?" she exclaimed. "Jesus!" I couldn't keep from laughing, thinking that little Jimmy was in deep shit right now. "Yeah, but that's not the point, is it, Lainey? His daddy wants to try to get back with his mommy. That's what it sounds like. Am I right?" She fiddled with the buttons on her blouse for a moment before answering. "He keeps trying." I could tell by the sound of her voice that the guy had a good chance of succeeding, and I didn't want to get in the way of that. I knew I needed to pull away a little, but I also wasn't about to pass up the opportunity to at least touch this hottie one more time. When we were done for the evening, I asked her to decide what she was going to do about her ex. The relationship with him wasn't healthy, and the kids needed to be treated fairly since he was their father and all. Lainey got back together with him, but as far as I know, they never got married. I've never seen a good-looking man like you eat so many blueberry pancakes in my life. Look here, Cassie May, I'm going to call Gunny my blueberry boy. Carol's smile sparkled against her swarthy skin and eyes. She was the owner of Rose's Diner, and probably the best short-order plate specialist in all of East Texas. Rose's served breakfast all day, and for me, few things were more satisfying than a stack of blueberry pancakes and fried sausage from Carol. "Carol, when are you going to get some pretty women to work here?" I winked at her when I said that because Cassie May appeared from around the corner with my order. Cassie and I had been buddies with benefits for the past year, since Lainey had gone back to being a homebody. "What do you want, Gunny blueberry blondes, blacks? Or maybe I can find you one of those exotic Eskimo women that men share with visitors in their igloos." Carol roared at her own attempt at humor, and her entire large figure swayed with each laugh. She had soothed my tortured soul ever since I'd returned to Beaumont a couple years ago. Though I didn't remember it, Carol had known my mom when I was very young and had stopped by when she started to get sick, so we knew each other. "I'll take this pretty brunette right here," I said, putting my arm around Cassie May's waist. "Yeah, but will she take you, blueberry boy?" The joke subsided. Everyone went back to their business, and another lunch was over. A few months later, I watched as perhaps the prettiest ash blonde I'd ever laid eyes on pulled her trailer into one of the old playgrounds Carol kept in her backyard next to the river. From the way she handled her car, she didn't need any help, but I offered and she agreed, so I helped her level the pad and bring in the utilities. If a man can be blinded by beauty, Anne Benoit is the right potion to help him do it. I quickly picked up a Louisiana accent, though she told me she'd come from Port Aransas a few months ago. Anne was in her early 30s, and Carol hired her as a waitress and line helper on the morning and lunch shifts. As a man in his early 40s, I thought I was past the amorous torpor stage, but I must have been wandering in unrequited desire for a few more days after that. Cassie remarked. All 4 years since I'd quit the Corps, I'd written letters and sent cards to Jace. At the same time, I'd had a lawyer trying to change the legal circumstances in my favor. Unfortunately, I learned that Mr. and Mrs. Huesos Taylor had been transferred to Germany, where the bastard was working as AAFES store manager. Jace was apparently with them. Before we could react, they were in Italy and then off to England. I didn't hear anything more from my attorney until he informed me that they were back in San Diego. When classes started, I received a packet of notices from the school system and the high school where Jace attended. Apparently, they were updating her records from the previous school and listed me as the contact person. Well, God bless Rhonda Bro once again. The school kept me in the loop, and when it came time for her graduation, I planned a trip to California to watch my little girl take her first steps into the adult world. My attorney reversed the old divorce decrees from years ago, though given the criminal charges threatening me, the judge was cautious. If I caused trouble, he'd grab my ass. Apparently, he thought even worse of the gun in that bastard's mouth than I did. In one important case, the lawyer really deserved his paycheck. He suggested I give the letter to Jace through the school, so I did. A week later, I answered her call. "Hey, baby, you have no idea how long I've waited to hear from you again." Hardy was on the verge of tears. "Hi, Daddy. I got your letter at school. The counselor gave it to me. She thought it was from some scholarship." And my lawyer sent the letter in a package with his charity's letterhead. "I know your mom doesn't miss my letters, so we figured this would work. I'm going to go to your graduation, if that's okay with you." Of course it was okay with me, so I was already making plans. I flew to San Diego, rented a car to get around, and after checking into a motel, I pointed it toward Rhonda Bro's old house, where the Taylors now lived. Time doesn't stand still for some people, especially when your emotions are torn in 100 different directions. The last time I climbed those steps, Rhonda was still alive, and Jace was a 13-year-old girl just beginning her journey to becoming a woman. Then her mother took her away again, and my life's torment began anew. "What do you want, Danny?" She did look well, but tired, the long years showing through the crow's feet around her eyes. She still retained some of her sensual appeal, but it would have been useless to me. I was just surprised she opened the door. "I just came to see my daughter, Sandra, that's all, and to let you know that I'll be attending her graduation tomorrow." "Why would you want to do that? You're not her daddy, and you haven't been for a long time." "Screw you, Sandra. I'm not here to fight with you, I'm just here to see my girl." She paused as if considering what to say, but apparently decided to hell with it and lost her temper. "Danny, you're a freak who gets violent every time something doesn't go your way!" Sandra shouted a few more obscenities, and I tried to calmly maintain some semblance of decorum, but finally just interrupted her and said, "All I want to do is attend my daughter's graduation, Sandra, and then I'll stop bothering you again, and your fairy tale life will continue." At that moment, her lips quivered, and if we had stood like that for a little longer, I don't know what would have happened. She didn't get a chance to let out another line. "I want him to leave, Mom." We both turned and watched him enter the room, and as we hugged, Sandra tried to interrupt her with a look of displeasure, but he immediately interrupted her. "That's enough, Mom. You've done enough already. My daddy's going away and nothing more." She was all grown up now, tall like me, but with her mother's hair and eyes and an infectious smile. I wasn't about to leave the foyer until Jace insisted, looking directly at my mother. "Grandma left me a house, Daddy, and now that I've turned 18, I get to decide who gets to live in it and who doesn't." She threw her mother a leering look, and that was the end of it. Sandra left the room and went upstairs, and the two of us stayed in the living room sipping iced tea. I learned that her stepfather had abandoned Sandra right after they returned from England and apparently ran off with a German woman he met while they were there. Sandra was left with an empty bag, and the two of them rented an apartment until the current tenants at Rhonda's house ran out of rent. There didn't seem to be any fairy tale life for that bitch to come back to. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't thrilled with the news, but I think I did a good job of hiding it from Jace. As it turned out, I didn't have to hide anything. She had pretty much learned the whole story of Sandra and I's divorce and subsequent events. Rhonda had written Jace several long letters and kept them in her journal, which had been left in the house when she was gone. She wasn't the type to talk nonstop, and here she didn't fail. "I hated Corey, you know," she said, sipping from her glass. "He was an evil man. He used to beat my mom's hands. He tried to do it to me once, and I slapped him so hard my arm hurt, and told him offhandedly that if he touched me again, my daddy would cut his damn heart out. I think that scared the hell out of him. He knows I'd do the same thing. He's lucky to be alive today." I haven't seen her in almost 5 years, but we've been in touch over the last few months as I found a common ground with her through school. I lost her adolescence, but the connections we made when she was a girl helped us get through it, as well as what her grandmother Rhonda instilled in her. I came to the graduation, and afterward, the two of us went out for a bite to eat before she went off to celebrate with her high school friends. I couldn't turn her down. Sandra wanted to talk later, but I waved her off. As far as I knew, she didn't have a damn thing I wanted to hear other than her last breath, and I didn't want to be present for that. After spending a few days there, I headed back to Beaumont to begin shutting down the plant. Mason Fremont's lifeless body hung over my shoulder, and I laid him on the ground behind the trailer. The girls called him Mange because he was always scratching his damn head. I just called him Asshole, short for rotten piece of shit. Frimpont was a lazy lowlife who bounced from job to job up and down the river and toward Orange whenever he could find work. He took early retirement from one of the refineries, and every once in a while I'd find him in my crew having to cover his sorry ass until the company finally had an epiphany and took him off the contractor call list. He found a temp job upriver that put some money in his pocket and started hanging out at the rows between shifts and continuing his rude mannerisms and comments. None of the girls wanted to put up with him, especially Anne, and after all, she was the one he was most drawn to, not that I could blame him. She's just gorgeous. Carol was having a busy day at the Rose. One of their assistants was sick and understaffed, and another of the girls had left because of baby problems. I picked up my plate when she set it down while Anne was busy in the backyard helping with the CP. Fremont, according to Carol, had been hanging out there since before lunch, sipping coffee and eating the morning Danish. I was just finishing another plate of pancakes and sausage when Anne came out of the back room looking like a drenched rat. A couple minutes later, Frimpont tossed a dollar bill on the table and walked out the front door to go back to his job, I guessed. Had I turned around a moment later, I wouldn't have seen his head sailing past the side window, heading toward Anne's trailer by the river. When I turned back to the waitress, I saw Frimpont walking through the trailer door. "Carol, we have a problem at the river. Frimpont." Carol held a large baseball bat next to the counter. I grabbed it and sprinted out the door, briskly heading for the river. As I entered the house, I looked toward the back room and saw him. There was no doubt now that he had entered Gunny's world. The bat had struck Fremont. Carol came in next to me and tried to comfort Anne. "You're all right now," I told her. "I saw him heading toward the trailer right after you left, and I knew he was up to no good." I told Carol about it, and then grabbed the bat behind the counter. "No one's going to miss that nasty bastard, and we don't need the cops, so I'll take care of it." I slung him on my shoulder and carried the body to the backyard. After the girls went back to the diner, Mason Fremont sailed off with Gunny Beauregard in a skiff, and as far as I know, no one has seen or heard from him since. I suppose that makes me a murderer in the eyes of some, and that may be true if it concerns them. On the other hand, I don't consider defending a person in this case to be murder, and other than not calling the police, I can sleep easy. Anne seemed to take everything for granted and got back on track. I certainly appreciated her new love and appreciation for my presence lately, and things soon returned to normal at the Rose. Her name is Macy, Gunny, and over there is her mom. Anne is her middle name. She hasn't run away from anything in 2 years. Carol made a serious face, but at the same time it was motherly kind. Anne, or Macy, didn't talk too much about her background. Like I said, I knew she was from Louisiana, but other than Carol, the only one who was close to her was old Sally across the river where she worked in a garden stand. It was about a year ago when she died, and Anne came to work for Rose. There was some guy here recently who asked about Anne and told me a little about her and then gave me a card to call her mom if I wanted to. I called, and her mom called me back when she found out she lived here and let me know who she was. Hell, I've been calling her Anne for a year now. Guess I'll have to get used to Macy now. She's in the trailer now, and her mom will be down there soon. I sipped my coffee and watched Macy's mom get up and give Carol a hug, then walk out the side door and head for the river. Like Carol, I too had to get used to a new name. The next morning, I was called in for an emergency plant shutdown, and by the time I was released for vacation a few days later, Macy was back in Louisiana with her mom. Cassie May was still working at the diner and picking over bones at my house a couple times a week, but one afternoon she sat down at the table and informed me that she had met a guy she thought she might have a serious relationship with. In the end, that must have been a good thing, because shortly thereafter, Jace announced that she wanted to stay with me for a while before starting college. She had been accepted to LSU in Baton Rouge after taking a few months off from school. I had an extra bedroom, and I was well enough trained in the Corps to keep things neat and clean, so Jace moved in without a problem. By the time she left for school, she had me in order and made me promise to visit when I could, and keep the spare room open for her returns. In all the time she'd been here, she'd never once mentioned her mother. It didn't matter. Sandra showed up in Beaumont about a week after Jace left. "Sandra, what the hell do you want?" She was sitting at my kitchen table, looking pretty damn good for a guy who hadn't entertained in 3 weeks. And it wasn't for lack of trying. I'd been busy with Jace and working at the plant for a week. "I just wanted to come clean and apologize, Danny. That's all." "What's there to apologize for, Sandra? I got over all that a long, long time ago and moved on with my life." "You know what I mean, Danny?" "No, hell no, I don't." "Look, what the hell are you even doing in Beaumont, girl? You run out of money? No place to live? That can't be right. You can still live at Rhonda's house. Speaking of which, do you know I was closer to her than her own daughter?" As soon as I said that, I regretted it. It allowed the conversation to get emotional, and I would lose my edge, which is exactly what happened. She started sobbing at the table. I remember thinking, screw me. I hate it when a woman cries, even if it's a bitch. I guess that's just the way I am. I know Rhonda hated what Sandra did, but she still loved her daughter, and I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, tears were pouring at my desk now. The Gunny's solution was to put a cold beer in front of her, which I did. A 6-pack, each. She ended up staying the night in Jace's room, and a week later she was still there. It was just mind-boggling. Somehow she thought that after all these years of not being married, she'd be able to convince me to give her another chance. The next morning I asked her to sit at the table. "Sandra, I don't know what you wanted to accomplish last night, but you should know that it's time to move on. I will never love you again. Hell, I don't even like you. That's just the way it is." "I can live with that, Danny." She startled me with her answer. "Maybe, but I certainly couldn't. So I guess the big question is, why would you want to?" She got up to pour herself a cup of coffee and refilled mine as well. "I've been afraid of you for years, Danny, ever since you stood up Corey and humiliated him in front of me. He never got over it and knew you would always outshine him because of it, and you know, he was right. He was pushing me away from you just by being around you, having a stable life and all that. He was making good money, or so it seemed to me, but it was all such a waste. I couldn't deal with you being gone for months on end all the time. The problem was, I couldn't handle you being gone forever either. So what do you dumbasses call it? Adjust and overcome? I just kept telling myself that you're some bad bastard I can't let close, and if I add Corey to the mix, things will go my way. It was his idea to adopt Jace, you know, not mine. His idea to pour salt on the wound. The problem is, Danny, I never stopped loving you, even after being divorced all these years and married to that pathetic shit for brains. How could I? Look at you. You're a tattooed bad boy Marine, hard as a nail and tender as a lamb when you want to be. I watched her sit there telling me all this and realized that no matter how syrupy her story was, it was all still bullshit in my ears. We were married for just over 4 years, Sandra, and that was a long time if you count the days and nights. I've had many women since then, one of whom I even married briefly. She raised an eyebrow at that revelation, but I didn't go into detail about my experience with Winona. You were here. You burned me, Sandra, and tried to make me feel bad. Hell, you made me feel bad. If it wasn't for Rhonda Bro, I never would have known Jace at all. I have to tell you, Jace doesn't like you too much for all of this. It doesn't matter, Sandra. I just don't want this relationship. I've been very kind in letting you stay here, but you need to realize what you're doing and move on, or go back to the way things were. I'm not a part of this. You have to leave when I get back tomorrow. If you need money to go back to America's finest, I can help. But you need to move on and figure out what you're going to do with the rest of your life. It's not here, for what it's worth. With those words, I got up, washed my cup, grabbed my car keys, and headed out the door. Honestly, I don't know what the hell she was talking about, other than wanting me to entertain her from time to time. Well, that's not true either. She wanted a fresh start, for crying out loud. When I returned the next morning after a night spent with Norma Lee, she was gone. There was a long letter on the dresser, which I put aside in a drawer and buried the ghost with a couple beers and a hamburger. Next chapter. Well, I'll be damned. Look at you, little girl. Macy Benoit, nicknamed Anne, lowered herself into the seat across from me, looking as beautiful as ever. Her hair had grown back a bit since I'd last seen her, and she had a polished look, much different from when she'd worked as a waitress at Carol's. Hi, Gunny. You look really good. She smiled. It made me feel good to have her sitting across from me. I'd be a liar if I said I hadn't lusted after this precious beauty since I'd first seen her. But there was something about her, admiration, respect, maybe even a sense of security, that made me see her as something other than a conqueror. Hell, I wasn't fooling myself. I could love a woman like that even if she was more than 10 years younger than me. I can't say I expected to see you around these parts, Macy, but it sure is nice to see you again. For a moment, I didn't catch her gaze, but I'd seen it in many women, and it was mutual. It was eager. After a few minutes of chatting with a few of the girls and Carol, she got down to business. I have something for you, Gunny, in my trailer. I guess I have red blood running through me, and I didn't need a second invitation. We got on with it. So where are you going to go next, baby girl? I don't know, Gunny. I guess I'll probably drive around for a while and see things I've never seen. Maybe go to California, maybe even Alaska. I don't know. Later in the afternoon, as she was getting ready to hit the road to go somewhere. When we parted, she hugged me tightly and slipped something into my pocket. Daniel P. Gunny Beauregard, I don't want you looking at this until I'm gone, okay? I mean it until I'm gone. I looked into her sweet eyes and just nodded. I needed to get back to the house in time for the start of another shutdown at the plant closer to evening. I kissed Macy Ann Beloit one more time and climbed into my truck, heading towards the house. She lingered to say goodbye to Carol and the girls as I waved goodbye and sped off. I don't think I had ever felt this way about a woman before that moment, not even Sandra when we were first married. I suffered through puppy love on the way home, and when I got there, I just stripped off everything and went to sleep until I had to get up and go to work. I was out of money for a few days because of the blackout, and when I finally got back to Rose's, the girls were scrambling to tell me about Carol. Slow down, Cassie May. I don't understand every word. Miss Carol left us in charge of the diner for a while after she left here a couple of days ago to look for Macy Ann. Why would she do that? Is she in some kind of trouble? I asked with growing concern. There were several people looking for her, and Carol wasn't too pleased with their behavior. She asked me to tell you to call her as soon as we see you. She tried to call earlier, but you were buried in the garden. We can't take phones and cameras with us, so I've always left mine in the truck, and for the last 4 days, I've slept on site in the trailer, taking only short breaks between shifts. Okay, then have one of you girls bring me my usual tea and I'll call her. The girls settled down, and while my order was being prepared, I called Carol. Gunny, thank God you called. I was so worried we wouldn't be able to reach you. What's going on, Carol? It's Macy Ann. She's gotten herself into a jam and I thought she needed some help. Can you get away for a while? Oh, hell, of course you can. Look, you need to come with us. Do you know where Lampasas is? Near Fort Hood? I grunted in appreciation. Okay, we'll be looking for you. Call me when you get closer. Oh, Gunny, did you look at what Macy gave you? It looks like she didn't. With those words, she left, and I watched Norma Lee bring my plate over to me, swaying her hips slightly more than usual. You haven't been here much lately, cowboy. Yeah, I've been working like hell. I'd completely forgotten about what Macy had slipped into my pants pocket that afternoon. I'd piled my jeans in a pile, and other than getting my wallet and keys out of them, they stayed that way in the wash. Later that afternoon, while packing a bag for a trip to Lampasas, I dumped the contents of Macy's gift onto a pillow on the kitchen table. Jesus Christ, I whispered, and let out a slow whistling sound. On the table, glistening under the light of the lamp, lay about 150 or so gemstones, mostly diamonds but also emeralds and rubies. These were not industrial rough-cut stones that I might find on a drill or saw blade. These were jewelry, 1 carat and up. I'm no expert, but there was a lot of money lying around on my old scratched kitchen table. I'm not a dressy, shiny man, but I know enough about what's going on to know that no girl from Louisiana, no matter how damn pretty she is going to come across such a treasure while picking up gems on a beach somewhere in Texas, or any other state for that matter. After a cursory look online, I estimated that the stones could be worth up to $1 million, at least at retail, but that's just a neophyte's guess in this arena. I put the stones back in my bag and locked it in a sturdy box I kept in the barn. It was late evening by the time I pulled into Killeen, Texas. The Denny's restaurant on Fort Hood was sparsely populated, mostly soldiers who had come out of a few bars downtown to grab a bite to eat before returning to post. Carol, I'm at the Denny's in Killeen. About time you got here. Were you fishing before you started work? She was being a wise ass, but that was okay. Back on track, she gave me directions to where they were. Instead of Lampasas, they ended up in Copperas Cove, staying with one of Carol's uncles. 20 minutes later, I pulled onto a long gravel driveway to a 1-story ranch house covered in stucco and set among live oaks and mulberry trees. Cedric White was a retired sergeant major with 38 years of service in the U.S. Army, including 3 tours in Vietnam, several tours in Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and his most recent addition to the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood. At the end of his service, he was promoted to division commander and decided to retire to stay close to his friends and the community he knew and served in. Carol and Macy were sitting in the kitchen with several other men drinking beer when I walked into Cedric's house. "Gunny!" was all she said before Macy jumped up from her chair and threw herself into my arms. "Thank you, Gunny Beauregard. I knew you'd come, and so did Carol." Glancing at Carol, I asked the appropriate question. "So what is it?" She nodded at Cedric. Cedric invited me to follow him, and the other 2 men joined us as we descended the stairs to the basement. 2 figures sat against the concrete wall, each with a burlap sack over their heads and their hands and feet securely bound. "They're not in the best shape right now," began Cedric. "But by morning we'll know all we need to know about them." They pounced with guns on my niece. Well, not here, but in Lampasas. Carol called me earlier and told me they were in trouble and needed help. Let's just say they shouldn't have gotten guns. There were 4 of us and 2 of them, and I'm sure they weren't prepared for the shitstorm coming at them. They both have New Orleans addresses and discarded cell phones, and I know these bastards aren't popos. We went back upstairs, and after a few minutes, Macy and I went and sat outside on the patio. She tucked her legs under her chin, and I had to work hard not to hold my gaze on the firm thighs that glistened in the moonlight that flooded the porch. "So what do you want to tell me about all this, Macy?" She looked at me, took a sip of her beer, and began to tell her story. "It's been going on for 3 years. I think maybe not that long, close. I caught my husband in our bed, with a couple whores, and things went downhill, and a good friend got really hurt. My husband was caught working or for hire. I don't know all the details. He got involved with a group of criminals, and they beat up a friend who was helping me. I ended up taking what I could and running away, and that's how I ended up at Carol's." "And the diamonds?" I asked. "Oh yes, they are." She smiled slightly. "They were in a safe I opened when I left. I had no idea about them, but I took everything in the box and whisked out of town on my tail. I later learned that the same criminals and my now ex-husband were suspected of being involved in a jewelry store robbery that was still unsolved. Jimmy, my ex, is serving a 20-year sentence in Dixon, Louisiana, after being convicted of organizing the robbery as well as beating up my friend. Hell, I'm talking like one right now, on my fingers. As for the gems, I have a bag of them with me, about as much as I gave you and Carol. I've done some research. If we can find a dealer, each sack will be worth about $1.5 million, but we'll probably have to go to New York for that, and we'll probably get 75% of fair value. I gave them to you, Gunny, because you mean the world to me and saved me when I was in trouble. Same with Carol. Macy, I believe those people downstairs are connected to those diamonds, right? We need to find out more, but I think Cedric and his friends have already figured it out. I hugged her tightly, and she walked back to Carol in the kitchen. It was getting late, so I went back to Cedric in the basement. Gunny, I'd rather you stay here with Carol and Macy to make sure no one else sniffs around. Besides, the fewer people involved in our case, the better. Do you have a gun? I do, an M1911.45 caliber and a Winchester in the truck. The three of them loaded the two hooded men into the back of a tarp-covered pickup truck, and in a few minutes, they were on their way down the gravel road to an unknown destination. Before leaving, I cast a glance at the only man standing guard near a pair of live oak trees. Is he your guy and will he stay? I asked. Inquired I. You're very good, Gunny, he replied quickly. Inside, both women were packing up for the night, and I settled down on the couch in the living room. It was only a few hours until dawn. The shotgun was on the couch behind my pillow, and I kept the .45 caliber pistol under my pillow. Fortunately, the sun was up, and I didn't have to use either one. The creak of the door opening from the bedroom woke me from my slumber as the girls headed into the kitchen for breakfast. A moment later, the aroma of strong coffee wafted through the house, and refreshed, I settled down at the table. We all ate rather quietly, and I took my plate to the guy who'd been in the trees all night. He was a little older than me, a retired infantryman named Justin, who had served with Cedric in Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom, and as we settled into the tree, sipping hot coffee, he told me about the previous events. Top called me and the other guys in a couple or 3 days ago on a personal matter. We've all known Top for years, and each of us has covered for the other so many times you can't count. I'm sure he'll return the favor. Anyway, he said it would be great. He grinned and continued. Cedric's relatives are good people, as is Carol, I'm sure you know. So when he told us what was going on, we were absolutely thrilled, as were you. Carol vouched for you, in fact insisted on calling you into this case. I guess you all have a story and everything. Anyway, Top asked the two of them to move into one of our houses in Lampasas until he could get there with us. He was in Dallas when Carol called, scared to death and all. He called me, and I headed for the house and the other two guys, and the three of us got into good positions when we got there. Top had already arrived and was telling us what happened when 3 guys showed up and set up a break-in before we could get inside the house. By the time we were ready to get down to business, one of them forced Carol to her knees and put a gun to her head. 3 of them? Interrupted I. Yes, but now there are only 2. The younger one got the son of a bitch good, 2 kill shots. Bam bam. The man folded up like a sack, and the other 2 were lying face down on the floor. It was a nice, clean operation. The thing is, Carol told Top that there were 2 of them, and 3 showed up. So, well, you know how it goes. We sit and watch and wait. We've done it hundreds of times. By the time they come back, we'll know all the way through. That's a guarantee. He laughed in relief, grimly realizing that Cedric and the others had been involved overnight. Jesus, Gunny. I'm really sorry you got dragged into all this. I really should be on a beach in California right now. Macy sat at the window looking out over the backyard, and I just gently stroked her shoulder as she took my hand in hers. I wouldn't want it any other way. We all need to stick together. Carol knows that. You know it too. You remember that old swear word, Mange, right? Now, when someone hurts your friends, you do the right thing, and it's the right thing to do. Yes, sir, I thought to myself. It's the right thing to do. Cedric came back a little earlier with two other guys and whistled to Justin from behind the trees. They no longer had the two captives with them, and as we gathered, he brought us up to speed, glancing at Macy before he began. It seems that the gentlemen who visited our nice congregation were once prisoners in a prison in Dixon, Louisiana. They were paroled 3 months ago, and they were quite intimately acquainted with a fellow named Jimmy Letourneau. I suppose Miss Macy is familiar with that. Macy merely nodded without saying anything. So, a little over 4 years ago, a freighter flying to Louis Armstrong in New Orleans was robbed by someone, who exactly is unknown now, but Mr. Letourneau was sure he knew how to get his hands on the loot from the robbery. It was over $20 million worth of gems. Diamonds, rubies, everything else. Our visitors got the information they needed, and as an incentive, Letourneau gave them this. He placed one large sparkling diamond, well over a carat, exquisitely cut, in the center of the table. Macy shifted her gaze from the table to Cedric. It gets even better. Letourneau was murdered in prison last week. Macy sighed upon hearing this news. Rumor has it, it was revenge for him screwing up and sending the wrong people upstairs. Be that as it may, he is no longer in this world, which brings us to the present moment. Our two gentlemen are no longer of interest to anyone, so for the moment, unless anyone else is still unaware, everything pertaining to our adventure is in this room. Cedric picked up the diamond, played with it in his fingers, and whistled. So, Carol, Macy, it looks like you're both in the safe zone for now, but I want to emphasize for now. I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Macy, that this lovely pearl has a bunch of other siblings. Am I right? Macy nodded her head again, and he continued. Okay, here's the thing. I'm an old soldier, and I'm not very good at these things, but I've been around long enough to know some people, and not all of them sit in church every Sunday, and I think you need a plan. Cedric laid out his proposal to us, and Macy agreed, only if Cedric and 3 of his boys would take a third, not 10% as he had suggested. Once everyone agreed, we started getting everything in order. The next day, Macy and I went to Port Aransas, across the bay from Corpus Christi, and got a room in a small motel across from the beach. The bank wouldn't open until Monday, so we had the rest of Saturday night and all day Sunday. Neither of us planned it, but we knew it was going to happen. And it did happen. Monday morning, she was at the bank, and when we got back to the room, all I could do was stare at her with my mouth hanging open in amazement. On the bed was a serious pile of gems and $100,000 in cash. That's enough cash for travel. 28 bags, that should be enough. There are 7 of us, and we'll make 4 trips. Cedric figures each trip will bring in $500,000. Macy kept 7 bags and returned the rest to her safe deposit box in the bank. A week later, the 6 of us boarded a flight to New York City, and the next morning made our first transaction at several diamond dealers on 47th Street. 3 months later, we repeated the process, and by the end of the year, we had completed all the deals and celebrated with a barbecue at Copperas Cove among the live oaks and mulberry bushes of Cedric White's modest ranch. The balance in several offshore accounts now totaled $156,34523. Cedric and his crew received their $5 million, and $635,000 was anonymously donated to the Killin Sergeants Club, of which Cedric was a board member. Macy tried to split the rest of it 3 ways, keeping the $1 million to split with the girls at the diner, but Carol and I insisted that we take as much per person as Cedric and his crew, and no more. Of course, the 2 of us still had the gift bags Macy had handed us earlier. Macy instructed us on how to proceed with the money. Always transfer the money to a second account and transfer it anonymously to your U.S. bank. Once you do this, pay federal income tax quarterly. If you leave Texas, make sure you cover all state taxes. Never forget to pay your taxes. Carol set the timer on her camera and hurried back to her spot for the group shot. I was in between the 2 women, and our 4 commandos diamond dealers were in front. It was a perfect shot, and Carol made sure we got framed copies later. Next chapter. I heard a knock on the door of my house, and although I didn't feel like taking a break from the LSU Aggies baseball game, I walked out into the foyer. I almost closed the massive door, but I didn't have time. "Hey, Danny!" It had been 4 years since I'd chased her away, and honestly, I hadn't regretted it for a day. Nevertheless, I invited her in, but not before looking around for some stale luggage. She still looked good, very good, and probably always would. You could still feel the youthfulness of 43 years old in her. "So, to what do I owe this displeasure, Sandra?" "Oh, Danny, don't be like that. You know you still love me." She even smiled at those words. Instead of arguing with her about it, I just asked what she was drinking and suggested she sit down at the kitchen table, putting the game on record mode. "So, what do you need?" She frantically buttoned the buttons on her blouse and brushed a strand of hair away from her eyes. "I need somewhere to stay for a while." "No way in hell." "Danny, please, I'm serious. Jace sold Mom's house, you know that, and I just got a new job in Port Arthur." "What do you mean you got a job in Port Arthur? You left San Diego to come here?" "It wasn't exactly here, in Beaumont, but just a few minutes south on Sabine." "Yes, Danny, I left home to come here. Jace took a job in Houston, and I wanted to be close enough to see her whenever I wanted." "What makes you sure she wants to see you?" I asked, knowing that there had been spats between them, although Jace had grown warmer toward her over the past couple years. "Cut it out, Danny. Now can I stay here for a while or not?" Before I could answer, a pair of wet, dripping kids ran into the house from the backyard and quickly slammed the door shut before a stream of water splattered the glass. Jimmy Johnson was now 14, and his sister Lucy was 12. We still fished for catfish in the tributaries of the Neches at least once a week, and when I sold my old house and bought this one, they talked me into putting a big pool in the backyard. With apologies, the two of them slipped out the door, and the noise in the backyard continued. "Neighborhood kids?" she asked. "Jimmy and Lucy Johnson. Known them for years. Great kids." "Ah, I see. Danny, I really need somewhere to stay for a while, and as soon as I get my first paycheck, I'll pay you well, with interest." She smiled. Before I could reply, we were interrupted. "Of course, she can stay here. We have room for guests. That's why we have an extra guest room over the garage, Danny." Sandra raised a confused look at her. One of the unspoken but strictly enforced rules between me and her was that she didn't talk to me about her mother, and she didn't talk to her mother about me. Sandra had no idea about that. I introduced myself. "Sandra, this is Lainey, the mother of those 2 children you met earlier. Lainey is my wife. Lainey, this is Sandra, my first wife, and Jace's mother." Lainey held out her hand, and both women shook it, Lainey nonchalantly and Sandra a little awkwardly. Lainey took Sandra to show her the guest quarters, and I went to retrieve the bags from the trunk of Sandra's car. "Jace, yeah, she's here. Stays in the gatehouse. You'd better come to keep her busy because I'll destroy her if I start drinking, and I'm looking at my 5th bottle of rum right now." Lainey Johnson had lived with her ex-husband for a total of 18 months before coming home from a shift at a rehabilitation hospital to find him in her bed with an 18-year-old girl from the next street over. By the next morning, absolutely everything that belonged to him and that he hadn't taken on the run was piled up by the sidewalk waiting for either him or the trash collectors. At that time, I was still a sort of big brother to the kids, but was absorbed into the gem capper, as we came to call it, and still went out with Norma Lee when I ran out of time, not to mention the occasional date with Macy's. About 2 years ago, when I was selling my old house and buying the one we have now, I broke up with Norma Lee because she was getting too clingy. Macy, well, that's a whole other story, which I'll tell you about a little later. One night while the kids were riding their bikes, Lainey brought me a beer. "Gunny, I want you to make love to me tonight. I can't get enough of it." So I did, and that night, and the next, and the next, and the next, until I was called back to work. When I got off vacation, we picked back up where we left off, and we'd been a couple ever since. He thought of Lainey as a woman as well as himself, so when things got going, I popped the question to her and gave her probably the most exquisite engagement ring ever given to a woman. Of course, I already had the stones. Lainey is different from any other woman I've ever met. She is years ahead of Sandra in grace and warmth. Next chapter. Macy and I met again in Port Aransas after we split the money bills. It had become a ritual for us. The same motel room on the same beach and a weekend of amazing lovemaking. If anyone tried to raise a hand to her, I'd kill them on the spot. "Gunny, I don't want this to end," she whispered as the fan dried the sweat on her glistening body. "It doesn't have to," I replied before she rolled over on her side facing me. "I can't stay, and I know you're tired of wanderlust. If I could convince you to drop everything and travel with me, would you agree?" She knew me as well as I knew myself. I'd motored from port to port and unit to unit throughout my years in the Marines and for several years afterward. I was tired of it and wanted a home with roots and a place where my daughter could come and visit me. I also knew that what Macy and I had was not the love of lifelong partners. It was the attraction of lovers and close friends. There was more to it than that. I was in my early 40s and she was barely in her 30s. She had a life of her own, and she had to live it on her own terms. She had no intention of marrying me. Maybe in a few years, blowing the life out of her with miles of asphalt and good times, but I needed it today, and I knew it would be with another woman. That was 2 years ago. Now I have Lainey and her kids. I'm 48 and she's 40. We have a big house with a big pool in Beaumont, Texas, where we both grew up, and we love each other without words. Lainey has met Macy. She knows the history, well, almost all of it, and when Macy passes through these parts, she always stops here for a few days before traveling on. The last letter we received from Macy was that she was in Santa Fe, New Mexico, running a little bistro on Johnson Street. Epilogue. Sandra lived above our garage for about 2 weeks until Jace convinced her to get her own place. One night, Lainey and I left the bedroom window open, and I played the trumpet with fervor, and my little bride sang like a prima donna. She didn't stay long in Port Arthur, then found another job in Houston, and moved in with Jace for a while until she got her own place. Jace. Her father hates to see this, but she fell in love with a young man who works in the athletic department at Rice University. I suspect she's going to marry him, but not until I have a good talk with him. Rose's Diner was given to the girls, and they run it just like they used to. I still get a plate of blueberry pancakes and sausage, but when I do, I usually have the whole family with me. Carol packed up and headed west, where she works as an executive chef at Macy's Bistro. About those 2 men in Copperas Cove, Cedric said only that they wouldn't bother anyone else. As to how he was able to get so much information, he said that there are a lot of ex-military people working in the prison system in Louisiana and Texas, and sometimes the good old fraternity helps. To this, I responded with a yai. All in all, it ended well for the old machine gunner from Beaumont, Texas. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.